The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1882, and Grace Jenkins read it 3 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to set it down on the kitchen table of her Boston boarding house room. A man named Owen Vaughn had responded to her advertisement, offering marriage and a home in Del Rio, Texas, and asking only that she be honest, hardworking, and capable of managing a household on the frontier. Grace had written back immediately, listing every skill she possessed except one, and now here she was, 6 weeks later, stepping off the dusty stage into the blazing Texas heat with a carpetbag in one hand and a heart full of equal parts hope and dread. Del Rio was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of weathered buildings huddled along the Rio Grande like travelers seeking shelter from the relentless sun. The air smelled of dust and horses, and something green that must have been the river itself. Grace smoothed her traveling dress, aware of how ridiculous her Boston finery must look in this raw place, and searched the handful of people gathered near the stage office for a man who might be Owen Vaughn. He stood apart from the others, tall and lean in worn denim and a brown hat that had seen better days. His face was tanned dark from years under the Texas sun, and when he removed his hat as she approached, she saw hair the color of summer wheat and eyes that were startlingly blue against his weathered skin. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 30, and there was a gentleness in his expression that made something tight in her chest loosen just a fraction. "Miss Jenkins." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, and Grace found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "Mr. Vaughn, it is good to finally meet you." "Owen, please." He reached for her carpetbag, and Grace saw that his hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard for everything he had. "Welcome to Del Rio. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "It was long," Grace admitted, "but I am here now and grateful for it." They walked together down the dusty Main Street, Owen pointing out the general store, the church, the saloon, speaking in that same quiet voice about the town and the ranch he ran a few miles outside it. Grace listened, trying to ignore the curious stares of the townspeople and the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had not lied in her letters, not exactly, but she had certainly failed to mention her one catastrophic failing. And now she was here, about to become this man's wife, and what would happen when he discovered the truth? Owen's ranch was modest but well kept, a sturdy house with a wide porch and a barn that looked newer than the house itself. Corrals stretched out behind the barn, containing perhaps 24 horses in various stages of training. Owen raised and trained horses, he explained as he helped her down from the wagon, selling them to ranchers and the occasional cavalry officer passing through. It was steady work, honest work, and he made enough to live comfortably if not luxuriously. "I know it is not much compared to Boston," Owen said, and Grace heard the uncertainty in his voice. "It is more than I had in Boston," she said truthfully. "Much more." He smiled then, really smiled, and Grace felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the warmth in those blue eyes. The wedding took place the next morning at the small Catholic church in town, with the priest and his housekeeper serving as witnesses. Grace wore her best dress, a dark green silk that had been her mother's, and Owen wore clean denim and a white shirt that looked stiff and uncomfortable on his rangy frame. The ceremony was brief, conducted in a mixture of English and Spanish that reflected Del Rio's position on the border. And then Grace was a married woman, standing beside a man she had known for less than 24 hours and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Owen had prepared a meal for their return to the ranch, cold chicken and bread, and preserves that he admitted he had purchased from a widow woman in town who did such things. They ate on the porch, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Grace had never seen in Boston's smoky air. "I want you to know," Owen said suddenly, setting down his plate and turning to face her, "that I do not expect anything from you that you are not ready to give. We may be married in the eyes of the law and the church, but I know this is strange for you, and I am a stranger to you still. I will sleep in the barn until you feel comfortable enough to say otherwise." Grace stared at him, surprised by the consideration in his offer. Most men would not have bothered, would have considered their marriage certificate license enough for anything they wanted. "Thank you," she managed. "That is kind of you." "It is only decent," Owen said, but he looked pleased that she had accepted. The next few days passed in a blur of learning and adjustment. Owen showed Grace around the ranch, introducing her to the horses and explaining his training methods with a patience that surprised her. He worked from dawn until dusk, and Grace did her best to make herself useful, cooking meals and cleaning the house and trying to learn the rhythms of this new life. It was on the fourth day that disaster struck. Grace had been washing their clothes, scrubbing Owen's work shirts against the washboard until her knuckles were raw, when she noticed that one of his shirts was missing 2 buttons. It was his nicest shirt, the white one he had worn for their wedding, and the buttons had simply fallen off, leaving loose threads behind. Grace stared at the shirt for a long moment, then at the small sewing basket she had found in the house. It had probably belonged to Owen's mother. He had mentioned she had died 5 years ago, and it was well stocked with needles and thread and buttons of various sizes. Any competent housewife could have repaired the shirt in 10 minutes. Grace could not sew. Not a stitch. Not a button. Not a torn hem or a ripped seam. She had tried to learn. God knew she had tried, but her fingers seemed incapable of the delicate coordination required. Her stitches came out crooked and loose. Her thread knotted and tangled. And after her mother had died when Grace was 12, there had been no one patient enough to continue the lessons. Her father had been a bookkeeper, content to send his daughters mending out to a seamstress, and never questioning why Grace never did it herself. But Owen would question. Owen would expect his wife to be able to perform this most basic of domestic tasks. Grace had managed to hide her incompetence so far, but she could not hide it forever. Not when every day brought new tears and missing buttons and worn-out seams that needed repair. She was still standing there, holding the shirt and fighting back tears of frustration when Owen came in for the midday meal. "Grace, is something wrong?" She turned to face him, and the concern in his eyes made her feel even worse. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you before we married." Owen's expression grew serious, but he did not interrupt, just waited for her to continue. "I cannot sew," Grace said in a rush. "Not buttons, not seams, not anything. I have tried to learn, but I cannot do it. My fingers will not cooperate and everything comes out wrong, and I know that is a terrible failing in a wife, and I should have told you, but I was afraid you would not want me if you knew. And now your shirt needs buttons and I cannot fix it, and I am so sorry." She ran out of breath and words at the same time, standing there with the shirt clutched in her hands and waiting for Owen's disappointment or anger or disgust. Instead, he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but a warm, genuine sound that filled the small house and made Grace look up in confusion. "That is what has you so upset. Buttons." "It is not a small thing," Grace protested. "A wife should be able to mend her husband's clothing. It is expected and I cannot do it, and that makes me useless." "Grace." Owen crossed the room and gently took the shirt from her hands, setting it aside before taking both her hands in his. "You are not useless. You keep this house cleaner than it has been in 5 years. You cook better than anyone I know, including that widow woman in town who charges twice what she should. You were out helping me with the horses yesterday, and I saw how gentle you were with that nervous mare, how patient. You are many things, but useless is not one of them." "But your buttons," Grace said weakly. "Then I will fasten your buttons forever," Owen said, his voice soft but certain. "And you can fasten mine. We will help each other with what we cannot do alone. That is what marriage is supposed to be, is it not?" Grace felt tears spill over then, but they were not tears of frustration anymore. "You mean that? You are not disappointed?" "I am the furthest thing from disappointed," Owen said, and the way he was looking at her made Grace's breath catch. "I was afraid you would be disappointed when you saw how little I have to offer compared to the life you left behind." "I left nothing behind," Grace said. "My parents are gone. I was working in a factory, living in a boarding house, and the only thing waiting for me in Boston was more of the same until I was too old or too sick to work anymore. You have given me a home and kindness, and that is more than I ever hoped for." Owen's hands tightened on hers, and for a moment Grace thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, though his expression remained warm. "We should eat before the food gets cold," he said. "And after, I will show you how I have been fastening buttons all these years. It is not as neat as sewing, but it works well enough." They ate together, the tension that had been building for days finally broken, and afterward Owen showed her his method for securing buttons using thin wire twisted through the holes and around the back of the fabric. It was not beautiful, but it was functional, and Grace found herself laughing as she tried to copy his technique. "Mine look like a bird made them," she said, holding up her attempt. "A very determined bird," Owen agreed, grinning at her, and Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest at the sight of that grin. The days that followed were easier. Grace stopped trying to hide her limitations and found that Owen had been sincere in his acceptance of them. He fastened buttons, and she cooked elaborate meals. He mended tears with his wire technique, and she kept careful accounts of the ranch's expenses in a neat hand that made him shake his head in admiration. They worked together, and slowly, carefully, they built something that felt like partnership. Grace found herself watching Owen more often, noticing the way he moved with quiet confidence around the horses, the way he spoke gently to the animals even when they were being difficult, the way he always washed up before meals and thanked her for the food she prepared. He was nothing like the rough, crude cowboys she had imagined when she thought of Texas. He was careful and considerate, and when he looked at her, it was with a respect that made her feel valued in a way she never had before. Owen, for his part, seemed equally affected. Grace caught him watching her sometimes, his blue eyes following her as she moved around the house or worked in the small garden she had started beside the porch. He still slept in the barn, true to his word, but Grace found herself thinking more and more about asking him to come inside, to truly be her husband in every sense of the word. It was on a warm evening in late May, nearly 2 months after her arrival, that everything changed. Grace had spent the day helping Owen with a difficult gelding, a beautiful bay horse that had been mistreated by its previous owner and was consequently terrified of men. Grace had approached the animal with soft words and patient movements, and after hours of work, the gelding had finally allowed her to touch his neck without flinching away. "You have a gift," Owen said as they walked back to the house, the sun setting behind them in a blaze of color. "I have been working with that horse for weeks with little progress, and in one day you have him eating from your hand." "He just needed someone who would not hurt him," Grace said. "He needed to know he was safe." Owen stopped walking, and when Grace turned to look at him, the expression on his face took her breath away. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know we married for practical reasons. I know I am not the kind of man who inspires grand passion or romantic feelings. But I need you to know that I have come to care for you a great deal. You have brought life back to this ranch, to this house, to me. If you do not feel the same, I understand, but I could not let another day pass without telling you." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Owen, I do feel the same. I have been feeling the same for weeks now, but I did not know if you wanted more than a housekeeper and a partner in the work." "I want everything," Owen said, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. "I want to wake up beside you every morning and go to sleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just a business arrangement. I want to love you if you will let me." "Yes," Grace breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper as she pressed closer to him. He tasted like coffee and sunshine, and when his arms came around her, Grace felt something settle in her soul, something that had been restless and searching for as long as she could remember. They stumbled toward the house, reluctant to break apart even for the few seconds it took to climb the porch steps. Inside, in the bedroom that had been Grace's alone for 2 months, they came together with a tenderness that brought tears to Grace's eyes. Owen was careful with her, reverent almost, and when it was over they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Grace's head on his chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," Grace whispered into the darkness, testing out the words and finding them true. "I love you too," Owen replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think I have loved you since that first day when you stepped off the stage looking so determined and terrified at the same time." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "I was sure you would take one look at me and send me back to Boston." "Never," Owen said fiercely. "You are exactly where you belong." The months that followed were the happiest Grace had ever known. She and Owen fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and holding each other through the night. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, with Owen's skill at training horses enhanced by Grace's gentle way with the difficult animals. Word spread, and soon they had more business than they could handle, with ranchers coming from as far as San Antonio to purchase Owen's well-trained stock. In September, Grace realized she was with child. She told Owen one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky, and the joy on his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he said wonderingly, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Grace asked, though she could see that he was. "Pleased does not begin to cover it," Owen said, pulling her close. "You have given me everything I never dared to hope for." The winter passed slowly, with Grace growing rounder by the week and Owen becoming increasingly protective. He insisted she rest more, do less of the heavy work, and Grace tolerated his hovering because she could see the love behind it. They spent the long evenings planning for the baby, discussing names and making plans to expand the house to add a proper nursery. In late March, exactly 1 year after Grace's arrival in Del Rio, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from town, and with Owen pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. But when it was over and Grace held her son in her arms, she knew she would do it 1,000 times over for this feeling. They named him James, after Owen's father, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. Owen held him with the same gentle care he showed the horses, and Grace felt her heart expand to encompass this new love, this tiny person who was the best of both of them. Life with a baby was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. James was a good-natured child, quick to smile and easy to please, and he seemed to thrive in the wide open spaces of the ranch. Owen doted on him, carrying him around as he did his chores and pointing out horses and cattle and all the wonders of their Texas home. One evening, when James was about 6 months old and babbling happily from his cradle, Grace was attempting to change his small gown when she noticed one of the tiny buttons had come loose. "Owen," she called, "could you help me with this?" He appeared in the doorway, took one look at the situation, and started to laugh. "Still cannot sew a button, not even a tiny one," Grace admitted, laughing with him. Owen crossed the room and scooped up his son, holding him while Grace removed the gown. "Well, James, your mother and I have an arrangement. I fasten her buttons and she fastens mine, and I suppose we will be fastening yours as well for a good long while." "It is a good arrangement," Grace said, rising to press a kiss to Owen's cheek and then to James's soft head. "The best one I could have asked for. Better than sewing," Owen teased. "Much better," Grace confirmed, "because it is ours." As the years passed, the Vaughn ranch continued to grow and prosper. Owen's reputation as a horse trainer spread throughout Texas and beyond, and Grace became known for her way with difficult animals, and for the fine meals she provided to the ranch hands they eventually hired as the business expanded. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Sarah with her mother's quick mind and fierce determination, and another son, Robert, who was quiet and thoughtful like his father. The children grew up learning that their parents had an unconventional arrangement regarding buttons and mending, and they thought nothing of it. It was simply how things were in the Vaughn household, one of many small ways their parents worked together to create a life that functioned smoothly despite its quirks. Grace never did learn to sew properly, though she tried once or twice over the years just to see if anything had changed. It had not, and Owen continued to fasten buttons with his wire technique, and Grace continued to excel at all the other aspects of running a household and a ranch. Their partnership remained strong through all the challenges that came with ranching on the Texas frontier, from droughts to storms to the occasional rustler passing through. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen presented Grace with a small box. Inside was a beautiful brooch made of silver wire twisted into an intricate flower design, with small buttons of various colors worked into the petals like jewels. "I made it myself," Owen said, looking almost shy. "I thought it was appropriate given our history." Grace laughed and cried at the same time, pinning the brooch to her dress and admiring how the buttons caught the light. "It is perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect. Like you," Owen said, pulling her into his arms. "Like us." On warm evenings, the family would gather on the porch, now extended and furnished with comfortable chairs, to watch the Texas sunset and share the events of their day. James, grown into a tall young man of 17, would talk about the horses he was training under his father's guidance. Sarah, at 15, would chatter about her lessons and her plans to become a teacher. Robert, just turned 12, would listen quietly and occasionally offer an observation that was surprisingly insightful for his age. Grace would sit with Owen's arm around her shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, and marvel at the life they had built together. It had started with a telegram and a desperate gamble, with fears about buttons and competence, and whether she would be enough. She had been more than enough. They both had been. One particularly memorable day occurred when Sarah was preparing for her first teaching position in the Del Rio schoolhouse, and realized that her best dress was missing several buttons. She appeared in the kitchen doorway looking distressed, holding the dress in front of her. "Mama, can you fix this? I need to wear it tomorrow for my interview with the school board." Grace looked at the dress, then at her daughter's anxious face and smiled. "I am afraid I cannot sew it, sweetheart, but your father can fix it with his wire method, or we can take it to Mrs. Patterson in town." "The wire method will show," Sarah protested. "People will think I cannot take care of my own clothing." Owen, who had been sitting at the table reviewing the ranch's accounts, looked up. "Then we will take it to Mrs. Patterson this afternoon, and she will have it ready by morning." "But Sarah, anyone who judges your capability as a teacher based on how your buttons are fastened is not someone whose opinion matters very much." "Your father is right," Grace added. "I have spent 20 years unable to sew a proper button, and it has not diminished me in the eyes of anyone whose opinion I value. Do not let the expectations of others define what you are capable of accomplishing." Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. "You really cannot sew at all, can you, Mama? I always thought perhaps you were exaggerating." "Not at all," Grace said cheerfully. "My stitches are terrible, my seams are crooked, and I have made peace with it. I can do many other things well, and that has always been enough." "How did Papa react when he found out?" Sarah asked curiously. Grace and Owen exchanged a glance, and Owen answered. "I told her that I would fasten her buttons forever and she could fasten mine, and I have kept that promise." "That is rather romantic," Sarah said, looking between her parents with new understanding. "In an unusual sort of way." "The best things often are," Owen replied, reaching out to take Grace's hand across the table. They took the dress to Mrs. Patterson, who had been mending clothes in Del Rio for 30 years and never asked questions about why Mrs. Vaughn needed her services so regularly. Sarah got the teaching position, and over the dinner celebrating her success, she announced that she thought her parents had the best marriage of anyone she knew. "You work together," she explained when James laughed and asked what she meant. "You do not expect each other to be perfect at everything. You recognize what each of you does well and support each other where you are weak. That seems much more practical than the romantic nonsense in the novels Mrs. Henderson lends me." "Romance and practicality are not mutually exclusive," Grace said. "Your father and I have both, and that is what has made our marriage strong." "I want that someday," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Someone who will fasten my buttons when I cannot do it myself, whatever form those buttons might take." "You will find it," Owen assured her. "When you meet the right person, you will know." James eventually took over much of the daily operation of the ranch, working alongside his father and developing his own reputation as a skilled horseman. He married a quiet girl from town named Elizabeth, and they built a house on the far edge of the property, close enough to help but far enough for privacy. Sarah did become a teacher and eventually the headmistress of the Del Rio school, and she married a surveyor who thought her intelligence was far more important than her ability to cook or sew. Robert studied law and opened a practice in town, handling disputes and contracts and gaining respect for his fair-mindedness. All 3 children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who Owen and Grace spoiled shamelessly. The ranch house was often full of noise and laughter, with children running through the rooms and out into the yard where the horses grazed peacefully in the sun. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Grace and Owen sat in places of honor at the head of a long table set up in the yard under strings of lanterns, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and friends from town and neighboring ranches. James stood to offer a toast, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. "To my parents, who taught us that love is not about perfection but about partnership. Who showed us that the small acts of service, like fastening buttons, matter just as much as the grand gestures. who built something lasting on a foundation of honesty and respect and genuine affection. May we all be so lucky in our own marriages. Everyone raised their glasses, and Grace felt tears threaten as she looked around at the life she and Owen had created. It had started with such fear, such uncertainty, and it had become something more beautiful than she had ever imagined possible. Later, after the guests had left and the children had taken the grandchildren home to bed, Grace and Owen sat together on their porch in the warm spring darkness, holding hands and listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked quietly. "Marrying a woman who could not perform one of the most basic domestic tasks." Owen turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "Never. Not for one single moment. You brought joy to my life, Grace. You brought love and laughter and children and a partnership that has sustained me through everything. Buttons are just buttons. What we have is so much more." "I love you," Grace said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them, perhaps even more so after 25 years of proving them through actions both large and small. "I love you too," Owen replied, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "And I will keep fastening your buttons for as long as I draw breath." "And I will keep fastening yours," Grace promised. They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead, two people who had found each other across the miles and built something extraordinary from honest need and unexpected love. The ranch stretched out around them in the darkness, full of horses and memories, and the legacy they would leave to their children and grandchildren. Grace thought back to that terrified young woman who had stepped off the stage in Del Rio 25 years ago, clutching a carpet bag and a heart full of secrets. She had been so afraid of being found wanting, of being rejected for her inability to meet all the expectations placed on a wife. Instead, she had found a man who valued her for what she could do rather than judging her for what she could not, who had kept his promise to fasten her buttons and had asked for nothing more than her partnership in return. It had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Owen's hair turned from wheat gold to silver, and Grace found lines appearing at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into the Texas sun. Their hands grew more gnarled, marked by decades of work, but they still fit together perfectly when they walked hand in hand around the property in the evenings. James took over the ranch entirely when Owen was 55, insisting that his father had earned a rest. Owen protested but ultimately agreed, spending his days doing lighter work and indulging his grandchildren with stories and attention. Grace continued to manage the household with the help of a young woman from town, teaching her to cook and keep accounts while carefully avoiding any discussion of sewing. Robert, now a successful lawyer, handled all the ranch's legal affairs and had expanded his practice to include clients from several surrounding counties. Sarah remained passionate about education, and through her efforts, Del Rio's school had grown from a one-room building to a proper schoolhouse with multiple teachers. Both children had married well and produced children of their own, giving Grace and Owen a total of 8 grandchildren who kept them young and entertained. On a warm afternoon in early summer, when Grace was 55 and Owen 58, they received unexpected visitors. A young couple arrived at the ranch in a tired wagon, asking to speak with the Vaughns. The woman was perhaps 22, with an anxious expression and hands that twisted together nervously. The man beside her was a few years older, sun-darkened and lean in the way of cowboys who worked hard for modest pay. Grace invited them onto the porch and brought out cool water and some of the sugar cookies she kept on hand for unexpected guests. The couple introduced themselves as Martin and Helen Turner, newly married and hoping to start a ranch of their own on a small piece of land Martin had inherited from an uncle. "We heard about you in town," Helen said, her voice soft and uncertain. "About how you built your ranch together, how you work as partners. And someone mentioned something about buttons, though I confess I did not quite understand what they meant." Grace and Owen exchanged a glance, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of marriage, and Owen gestured for Grace to explain. "When I first arrived in Del Rio as Owen's mail-order bride," Grace began, "I was terrified that he would reject me because I could not sew. I cannot sew at all, you see. Not a stitch, not a button, not anything. It is a failing I have carried my whole life, and I was certain it would make me unacceptable as a wife." Helen's eyes widened with recognition and something that looked like relief. "Owen told me that he would fasten my buttons forever, and I could fasten his," Grace continued. "He meant that we would help each other with the things we could not do alone, that we would recognize each other's strengths and support each other's weaknesses. That is how we have lived for over 30 years now, and it has served us well." "I cannot cook," Helen blurted out, and Martin reached over to take her hand supportively. "I can sew beautifully, I can clean, I can do everything else, but I cannot cook anything that is fit to eat. I have tried and tried, but everything I make is either burned or undercooked or tastes like leather." Martin says he does not mind, that he knows how to cook from his years working on cattle drives, "but I feel like such a failure as a wife." "You are not a failure," Grace said firmly. "You simply have a task that does not come naturally to you. That does not make you lesser or unworthy, it makes you human." "But people in town," Helen protested, "they will think I am lazy or incompetent." "Some will," Owen acknowledged. "There are always people who will judge you based on their own narrow expectations. But the people whose opinions truly matter, the people who will become your real friends and community, will judge you on your character and your efforts, not on your skill in the kitchen." "Martin does most of the cooking now," Helen admitted. "I do the cleaning and the mending and everything else, and he cooks, but I worry that people will think less of him for doing woman's work." "Let them think what they will," Martin said, speaking up for the first time with a quiet determination. "I would rather cook every meal for the rest of my life than watch you make yourself miserable trying to do something that does not come naturally to you. We are partners, Helen. That means we work together, using the skills we have." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion, seeing her own story reflected in these young people. "You will do well," she said. "I can see that you already have what it takes to build a good marriage and a successful ranch. You have honesty and respect and a willingness to work together. Everything else is just details." They talked for another hour, with Owen offering advice on ranch management and horse training, and Grace sharing what she had learned about dealing with small-minded people and building a life that worked for you rather than for others' expectations. When the Turners finally left, they looked lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted from their shoulders. "You think they will make it?" Grace asked as they watched the wagon disappear down the road toward town. "I think they have a better chance than most," Owen replied. "They already understand what too many couples never learn, that marriage is about partnership, not perfection." "We were fortunate to learn that early," Grace said, leaning against Owen's shoulder. "We were fortunate in many ways," Owen agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head in the familiar gesture that still made Grace's heart flutter even after all these years. The story of the Turners and their visit spread through the community, as stories do in small towns, and it brought a few more couples to the Vaughn Ranch over the following years. Young people who were struggling with expectations they could not meet, who needed to see an example of a successful marriage that did not fit the traditional mold. Grace and Owen welcomed them all, sharing their experience and their wisdom, and watching with satisfaction as these couples went on to build strong partnerships of their own. One particularly cold winter evening, when Grace was 60 and Owen 63, they sat before the fire in their comfortable parlor. Grace was working on the ranch accounts, a task she still enjoyed, despite her age making the numbers sometimes difficult to read in lamplight. Owen was using his careful wire technique to fasten a button on one of his work shirts, the same method he had used for decades. "I was thinking today," Owen said, his voice reflective in the way it got sometimes in the evenings, "about the day you arrived in Del Rio. Do you remember how terrified you looked? I was certain you would send me back," Grace said, setting down her pencil. "I thought no man would want a wife who could not sew. I thought no woman would want a lonely cowboy with a modest ranch and no prospects beyond hard work and simple living," Owen replied. "We were both wrong about what the other needed." "What did you need?" Grace asked, curious even after all these years. Owen looked at her across the fire, his blue eyes still clear and bright despite the years. "I needed someone who would be my partner, not just my housekeeper. Someone who would work beside me and challenge me and make me laugh. Someone who would love me for who I was, not for what I could provide. I needed you, Grace, exactly as you were and exactly as you are. And I needed someone who would value me for what I could do rather than diminishing me for what I could not," Grace said softly. "Someone who would keep his promises and build a life with me based on honesty and mutual respect. I needed you, Owen, my button-fastening, patient, wonderful husband." They left their respective tasks and came together on the settee, holding each other in the firelight and feeling grateful for the 38 years they had shared and the years still to come. The ranch changed with the times, as all things must. Trains brought more people to Del Rio, and the town grew from a sleepy border settlement into a bustling community. The open range began to be fenced, and the wild quality that had defined Texas when Grace first arrived gradually gave way to something more settled and civilized. Through it all, the Vaughn Ranch remained a constant, still producing fine horses and still run by the partnership between Owen and Grace, and now, increasingly, by James and his family. When Grace was 65, she published a small book about ranch life and the challenges of building a home on the frontier. It was not a grand literary work, but it was honest and heartfelt, and it sold surprisingly well among women who were considering moving west or who were struggling with the realities of frontier life. She wrote about many things, including her inability to sew and Owen's promise to fasten her buttons forever, and the response was overwhelming. Letters arrived from women all over Texas and beyond, sharing their own stories of skills they lacked and partners who supported them anyway. Some women could not cook, others could not clean properly, and one memorable letter came from a woman who was an excellent housekeeper but could not ride a horse to save her life, much to her rancher husband's amusement. They all wrote to thank Grace for making them feel less alone, less deficient, and more hopeful about their own partnerships. Grace answered every letter, sometimes with Owen's help when her hands grew tired from writing. They shared what they had learned over their decades together, and they encouraged these women to embrace their strengths and accept their limitations with grace and honesty. "You have become quite famous," Owen teased one afternoon as Grace sorted through another batch of letters. "Not famous," Grace protested. "Just visible. There is a difference. You are giving women permission to be imperfect," Owen said more seriously. "That is important work, Grace, perhaps more important than anything we have done with the ranch." "We did the important work together," Grace corrected. Your acceptance made it possible for me to accept myself. That is what I am really sharing in these letters, the power of having a partner who sees you clearly and loves you anyway. Owen crossed the room to stand behind her chair, resting his hands on her shoulders. I do see you clearly, and I do love you. More with every passing year, impossible as that seems. Grace reached up to cover one of his hands with hers, feeling the familiar calluses and scars, the strength that had supported her through everything. Not impossible at all. I feel the same way about you. They celebrated their 40th anniversary with a huge gathering that brought together family, friends, neighbors, and even some of the couples who had visited them for advice over the years. The Turners were there with their 3 children and a thriving ranch of their own. Sarah and her husband came from the new home they had built in San Antonio. Robert arrived with his wife and 4 children. James and Elizabeth hosted the party at the main ranch house, which had been expanded and modernized but still retained the essential character of the home Owen and Grace had built together. Toasts were offered, stories were told, and laughter rang out across the property as the sun set over the Texas landscape. Grace, now 65 with silver hair and lines that mapped out every smile and worry and joy of her life, looked around at the gathering and felt a profound sense of contentment. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, coming to stand beside her at the edge of the celebration. "That we built something extraordinary," Grace said. "Not just the ranch or the family, but the life we have lived together, the partnership we created from honesty and mutual support. That is what I am most proud of, Owen. Not the horses we trained or the land we accumulated, but the life we lived together." "I feel the same way," Owen said, taking her hand in his. "You have been my greatest adventure, Grace Jenkins Vaughn, my greatest joy and my greatest blessing, even though I still cannot sew a button." "Especially because of that," Owen said with the smile that had charmed her 40 years ago and still made her heart skip. "Because that inability brought us to our arrangement, and our arrangement became the foundation of everything good in our life together." As the stars began to appear overhead and the celebration continued around them, Grace and Owen stood hand in hand, watching their family and friends, and reflecting on the unexpected path that had brought them to this moment. A telegram, a desperate gamble, a secret shame, and a simple promise had transformed into a love story that had lasted 4 decades and counting. The years continued their steady march. Owen's health began to decline when he was 70. Nothing dramatic or sudden, just the gradual slowing that comes with age. He could no longer work with the horses the way he once had, but he still visited the corrals daily, offering advice and encouragement to James and the ranch hands. Grace's hands grew arthritic, making even her careful bookkeeping difficult, but she persisted with the help of reading glasses and determination. They spent more time together, taking slow walks around the property, sitting on the porch in companionable silence, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company after decades of partnership. The grandchildren visited regularly, bringing great-grandchildren now, and the house was often full of young voices and the chaos that comes with small children. One afternoon, when Grace was 70 and Owen 73, Owen called her to the workshop he maintained behind the barn. She found him there, holding a small wooden box he had spent months crafting in secret. "What is this?" Grace asked, touched by the obvious care that had gone into the box's construction. "Open it," Owen said simply. Inside, Grace found buttons. Hundreds of buttons of every size and color and material imaginable, collected over their 48 years together. Buttons Owen had fastened with his wire technique. Buttons from shirts and dresses and children's clothes. buttons that represented every stage of their life together. "I saved them," Owen explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Every button I ever fastened for you I kept. I wanted you to have them, to remember that I kept my promise. I fastened your buttons, Grace, every single one, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the collection, each button a small monument to their partnership and Owen's faithful love. "I do not have anything like this to give you," she said. "No collection to show how I kept my promise to fasten yours." "You have given me everything that matters," Owen said, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "You have given me love and partnership and a life beyond anything I dreamed possible. You have fastened every button that truly needed fastening in my life, Grace. You have held me together when I would have fallen apart. That is worth more than any box of buttons could ever represent." They held each other in the workshop, surrounded by the tools of Owen's trade and the evidence of his devotion, and Grace felt grateful beyond words for the life they had built together. Owen passed away peacefully 2 years later, on a warm spring morning with Grace holding his hand and sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows. He was 75, and he had lived a good life, full of work he loved and a family he adored. His last words were for Grace. "Keep fastening buttons," he whispered. "Keep helping people. Keep being the remarkable woman you are." "I will," Grace promised, though her heart was breaking. "I love you, Owen. I will love you forever." "Forever," Owen agreed. And then he was gone, slipping away so peacefully that Grace almost did not realize he had left until she felt the absence of his presence, the stillness where his breathing had been. The funeral brought together everyone whose lives Owen had touched, which turned out to be a considerable portion of Del Rio and the surrounding ranches. People shared stories of his kindness, his skill with horses, his quiet wisdom, and his devotion to his wife. Grace sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, drawing strength from their presence even as she mourned the loss of her partner of 50 years. In the days and weeks that followed, Grace discovered that grief was not a straight path, but a winding road with unexpected turns. Some days were easier, filled with happy memories and gratitude for the years they had shared. Other days, the absence of Owen was so acute she could barely breathe. But she persisted, drawing on the same determination that had brought her to Texas 50 years ago, and the strength Owen had always said was her greatest quality. She continued to live at the ranch, in the house she and Owen had shared, surrounded by evidence of their life together. The button box sat on her dresser, and sometimes she would open it and run her hands through the buttons, remembering. The brooch Owen had made for their 10th anniversary still pinned her best dress. The porch where they had spent countless evenings still offered a view of the Texas sunset that never failed to move her. James and Elizabeth tried to convince her to move in with them, worried about her living alone at 72, but Grace refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "Owen and I built it together, and I am not leaving it unless I have no other choice." She found purpose in continuing the work she and Owen had begun, welcoming young couples who needed advice and encouragement, answering letters from women who had read her book and found hope in her story. She became a sort of elder stateswoman of the community, the woman you went to when you needed wisdom about marriage or partnership, or how to build a life that honored your strengths and accepted your limitations. One day, about a year after Owen's death, a young woman appeared at Grace's door. She was perhaps 20, with frightened eyes and a carpet bag that looked much like the one Grace had carried 51 years earlier. "Mrs. Vaughn, my name is Clara Mason. I am supposed to marry Thomas Porter next week, but I need to tell you something, and I hope you will not think I am foolish." Grace invited her in, made tea, and listened as Clara poured out her story. She was marrying a good man who ran a small ranch, but she had a secret she was terrified to reveal. She could not manage money, could not do figures in her head or keep accounts no matter how hard she tried. Her father had always handled such things, and she was afraid Thomas would be disappointed or angry when he discovered her inability. "Have you told him?" Grace asked gently. "No," Clara admitted. "I am too afraid." "Then you must tell him before the wedding," Grace said firmly. "My husband told me something on our wedding night that has proven true throughout our 50 years together. He said that marriage should be based on honesty and trust, and that we should help each other with what we cannot do alone. If Thomas is the right man for you, he will understand and you will find a way to work together." "What if he rejects me?" Clara whispered. "Then he is not the right man," Grace said simply. "But I suspect if he is the good man you say he is, he will surprise you. People are often more understanding and compassionate than we give them credit for." Clara left with renewed courage, and Grace learned later that she had told Thomas about her difficulty with figures. Thomas, it turned out, enjoyed bookkeeping and was happy to take over that task in exchange for Clara managing everything else. They married on schedule and went on to build a successful partnership, occasionally visiting Grace to thank her and update her on their life. Grace continued this work for another decade, becoming something of a legend in Del Rio and the surrounding area. She was the woman who had built a successful ranch, despite being unable to sew, the woman whose husband had promised to fasten her buttons forever, the woman who proved that perfection was not necessary for a good and meaningful life. On a warm spring day, just after her 82nd birthday, Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was found by Elizabeth, who had come to bring lunch and found her sitting in Owen's chair on the porch, facing the Texas sunset she had loved for more than 50 years, with a peaceful expression on her face and the button box held loosely in her lap. The funeral was even larger than Owen's had been, with people coming from across Texas to pay their respects to the remarkable woman who had touched so many lives. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered, along with countless couples who credited Grace and Owen with helping them build strong marriages, and women who had found courage in Grace's example to accept themselves as they were. Sarah gave the eulogy, speaking about her mother's courage and honesty, her determination and kindness. "My mother taught us that we do not have to be perfect to be worthy of love," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the assembled mourners. "She taught us that partnership means supporting each other's strengths and helping with each other's weaknesses. She taught us that the small acts of service, like fastening buttons, are the foundation of lasting love. And she taught us all of this simply by living her life with integrity and grace." Grace was buried next to Owen in the Del Rio Cemetery under a headstone that reads simply, "Grace Jenkins Vaughn, 1857–1939. Beloved wife, mother, and friend. She could not stitch, but she mended hearts." And below, added by her children, a final line, "He fastened her buttons, she fastened his." Together, they fastened a family. The ranch continued under James's management and eventually passed to his children and grandchildren. The house remained much as Grace and Owen had left it, a monument to their partnership, and a reminder to all who visited of what could be built on honesty and mutual support. The button box was passed down through the generations, along with the story of the mail-order bride who could not sew and the cowboy who promised to fasten her buttons forever. It became a family treasure, a tangible reminder of the love that had founded the Vaughn family and the partnership that had sustained it through generations. Years later, Grace and Owen's great-great-granddaughter, researching family history for a school project, came across the letters Grace and Owen had exchanged before their marriage. She read Grace's careful omission of her inability to sew, Owen's simple requirements for a wife, and the telegram that had brought them together. She found Grace's book about ranch life, with its honest discussion of imperfection and partnership. And she found, preserved in a frame in the ranch house, a simple piece of paper with words written in Owen's careful hand. "Then I will fasten your buttons forever." The girl, just 16 and struggling with her own feelings of inadequacy, felt something shift inside her as she read those words and learned the story behind them. She realized that her ancestors had built something extraordinary not despite their imperfections, but through their willingness to be honest about those imperfections and support each other through them. She took the button box to school for her presentation, explaining to her classmates how a simple inability to sew a button had become the foundation for a love story that lasted 50 years and created a legacy that continued more than a century later. Some of her classmates laughed, not understanding how something so small could matter so much. But others understood, and they came to her afterward with their own stories of things they could not do and fears of being found wanting. The legacy continued, rippling out through time, touching lives in ways Grace and Owen could never have imagined when they stood on that porch in Del Rio more than a century ago and promised to fasten each other's buttons. Their story became part of the fabric of the community, a reminder that love is not about perfection but about partnership, not about meeting impossible standards, but about accepting each other's limitations and celebrating each other's strengths. And somewhere, in the vast Texas sky where legends say the spirits of the faithful rest, Grace and Owen smiled down on their descendants and the lives they had touched, content in the knowledge that their promise to fasten each other's buttons had become something far greater than either of them had ever dreamed possible. They had built not just a ranch or a family, but a legacy of honest love and mutual support that would continue to inspire for generations to come. Their story proved that sometimes the smallest promises, kept faithfully over a lifetime, create the strongest foundations. That admitting weakness can lead to unexpected strength. That partnership, built on honesty and maintained through daily acts of service, can transform two strangers into soulmates and create a love that echoes through time. The mail-order bride could not stitch. The cowboy said then, "I will fasten your buttons forever." And in keeping that simple promise, they built something eternal.